it turns out you're still you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nowhere you can go to get away from you. And that's not a bad thing. It just takes wanting to accept the love that God has for you and to know and accept that he doesn't make mistakes.
Welcome to Uncuffed episode 11. We are going to be talking about true-ish lies. So I am your host, Kennel Cuffey, and I have the pleasure of introducing the world to one of my dear friends and my sometimes therapist, Dr. Rachel Burke. She is a licensed therapist and she does some amazing work out in the community, and she does some really cool things at Hope Community Church where we serve. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I do want to clarify that I'm not your therapist.
That's right. Legally, she cannot be.
No.
It's just a little inside joke we have. But Rachel is the smartest person I know.
That sounds like pressure.
It's supposed to be, right?
Okay.
So tell us a little bit about your background, where you went to school. How long have you been doing this work?
So my undergrad college career was at Johns Hopkins, where I didn't start as a psych major there, but I ended as one, as God more clearly was directing my path halfway through that experience. And then I went to graduate school in Arlington, which was a clinical psychology school. So I have my doctorate in psychology as a PsyD instead of a research-based program, which would end in a PhD. And then after that, or as part of that, did several practicums and internships. And my focus, my concentration was in child and family therapy.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So that means that this topic today is right in your wheelhouse, I'd assume.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to break it down a little bit, the idea of true-ish lies, we're going to be talking about the things that we tell ourselves, or the ways that we identify ourselves, and how they carry a little bit of truth, but at the end of the day, they are lies. Yeah. So how about we jump into the first question and see where we go from there?
Okay. Sounds good.
So my first question is, why is it that the lies that we tell ourselves, why does it seem to ring so much truer to us, in spite of what people on the outside are telling us, in spite of what God is saying of us? Why does it seem to be so much louder and carry so much more weight than the truth that we know in our hearts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there'd be a lot of different theories about how that develops, right? Like who do we really think that we are? How do we experience ourselves, and what do we expect from ourselves? What are we expecting from the world? And to sum it up, the basic idea is that we have internal drives that interact with our experiences and kind of solicit different responses from our environment. And we're designed to learn, and to learn quickly. So even as young children, we are holding on to, I guess, like handles in life, or some would say kind of core beliefs that are so deeply rooted in us that as we develop through the ages, those layers are put on top of those core beliefs. So even if we learn something later in life through a different experience, or people respond differently to us, it doesn't those later lessons don't penetrate those core beliefs.
Man, that sucks.
It can.
Oh my God.
And then if your environment when you're little is maladaptive, like is dysfunctional, the way you learn to interact with it then becomes really maladaptive. But they were lifelines. Like, this is how you get through the hard, confusing times of childhood, right? And so we rigidly hold on to these things, and it takes a real transformation to let go of those things and let real truth come in, Because if you think of it, like we interact all the time as little kids with parents, if we're blessed and have two parents in a home, in even a reasonably functional home. There's still a lot of chaos going on, a lot of needs trying to be met, right? And schedules followed and success chased after. And so we pick up messages about ourselves and our importance, and if we deserve to have attention paid to us, if we are a nuisance, or if we're a joy to others. And we learn those lessons early on. And then if it's a dysfunctional environment, we've learned maladaptive coping skills to try to get our needs met. And we don't shake those very easily.
Okay, so at what age do you think that those things sort of cement themselves fully? Is it when you're a teenager, because I've heard before that the way you raise a child, I think at the age of 7 is when the initial habits start to form. But is that the same with the way that we identify ourselves, or our id, I guess is what it's called?
It depends on the foundation still. So like that first year of life, the needs are fairly basic, right? Like we need held, we need loved, we need contact, we need fed, we need treated gently, and we need exposed to sights and sounds and things while being loved and cared for. And so if that base is solid, and we, in our core self that's even being developed then, if we believe the world to be a safe place where we expect to be able to interact in the limited capacity we can, but while still getting our needs met, then other things grow more nicely on top of that, right? But then you transition into toddlerhood, and if your parents can't transition with you, now you're this kid who's into everything and more difficult to deal with, and your needs are different. And so if at that point you're accidentally given the message that you're a bother, or you frustrate people, or my curiosity causes anger in others, or something negative like that, as long as you're paying attention to the people's responses around you, you learn from that. So you learn to try to not make people mad, or maybe make people mad if you're a child who needs a lot of stimulation, right? Like, oh, that's how I get the stimulation I need from others. I make them mad. So we're constantly learning. So I think that there are many renowned psychologists and psychiatrists that disagree with this, but from my education, from my experience, I think that we're very fluid beings. It's just that meaning like we don't learn something as a young child at whatever age that is, whether it's age 1 or 7 or 13, and then we're static from there. That's not how it goes. But the way we try to fit into society, like the expectations, is that once we're a teenager, people start asking us, what do you want to be when you grow up, kind of thing. So they give us this idea that you are formed well enough now, and you should now know yourself, and you should now pick your path in life, and then that's what you will be as a static thing. So there's those kinds of messages that say, okay, you formed well enough now just be who you are, right? And that gives us the idea that we stop learning and growing and changing, right? Like there are adults who think if I don't know how to do something by now, then I don't know how to do it. And that's just how I'm going to live life. And
that's a death sentence, in my opinion.
It is, but as a little toddler, you'd never think that. You know, we stink at learning to walk, but we push through it and do it because we're eager to learn new things. We're okay with falling. We're okay with people laughing at us when we're trying to toddle, right? But pretty much by the time we enter school, like age 4 to 7, that area, when we start to really compare ourselves to others, we start kind of unnecessarily cutting off some of our opportunities. You know, if we're naturally supposed to be good at something, like we've been gifted with some kind of ability, but we see that other people are already better at that, like maybe an older sibling
Okay.
or a classmate, then we might not even explore that option, right?
Wow. I never even thought about the idea that we suppress our gifts to give room to other people.
Yeah. Or because we've already quickly assessed, even if I try really hard, I'll never be better than my older sibling. Or my older sibling gets a lot of attention because of this, so I got to find something else to
Get there.
Yeah.
I like that you originally used the word stimulation versus attention. That puts a different spin on it for me, because right now we are dealing with our daughter who is 7. She just turned 7, and she constantly needs, I'm going to use the word stimulation here. She constantly needs stimulation. And my wife and I are both the type of people where we want her to experience boredom.
Yeah.
Because she's a very creative kid. She loves science. She loves astronomy. And we're like, if you would just go off on your own and do this stuff, you know, a whole world will be open to you. But I was having a conversation with my wife, and this is kind of going back to the whole idea of stacking, and you almost delved into the world of trauma there.
Yeah.
But when our daughter was 3, she experienced the loss of 3 of our foster kids at one time, overnight.
Wow.
And we've been struggling with her because she will do some things, and we're always like, man, she's not acting her age. She's acting like a 3-year-old. She's that, you know. And it dawned on us the other day, and you can tell me if this is wrong or not, that maybe perhaps because that was a huge traumatic experience for her, the loss of siblings, that she's almost dipping back into that age because of that trauma experience. And that's been really hard for us as her parents to have not recognized that, and to think, oh my gosh, she's just immature here, or these certain situations bring out a very young version of our daughter, when most of the time she's a very mature kid. So how do we combat those things, even as adults? How do we, let's take this twofold. How do we combat this as a parent for your child, where you know they've experienced this stunting, if it is a stunting, I'm just assuming here. And how do we as adults combat those traumas or those situations where we didn't get the stimulation that we needed when we needed it, how we
Or the
needed.
comfort, maybe.
Yeah, or
in
the
this
comfort.
case.
Yeah.
Okay. So trauma does change our natural trajectory. And it's when someone experiences trauma, not only is that like a shift from a normal developmental process, but it's also a very heightened learning moment.
Okay.
Right? So whatever is learned during that moment of trauma, and the moment can stretch, a couple months, but that moment of trauma is going to be learned at such a cellular level almost, that it is going to be difficult to change. And then when you have a daughter that's like overall acting like a 7-year-old or more, and then there's these moments where she's 3, that takes a lot of awareness and shifting on your part to meet her needs in the moment, right? Because if we expect from a 3-year-old what we would expect from a 7-year-old, that's unrealistic on our end as parents. And so if you can see those moments and comfort or teach differently when you see that, then eventually there's a release or a healing, right? Where she can catch up then. But I think for sure with something like that needs to be, God reaching into her heart and healing her around that. Yeah.
Okay. So how do adults deal with almost a stunting that happens from negative situations in your childhood?
There's a lot of different therapy options to deal with that. But to start with, knowing that trauma causes you to interpret current reality very differently than you otherwise would. And then also to realize that not everybody around you is aware of that. We don't wear our trauma physically on our sleeve. Most of us don't. Most of this is emotional or, psychological trauma. And so other people do not know. And so they would look at you and expect you to act just based on what's going on in the moment, right? And so when other people react without compassion because they don't know why you're really misinterpreting the moment so drastically, it's important to not blame those people. It's important, I think, to not even ask those people to, you can ask them to have compassion, but to not ask them to share your distorted reality, and instead to summon the courage to be able to kind of hold two versions of reality, right? This is what I think and feel that's happening right now, but I know it's based on my trauma. And then this is what is actually happening. And that gap between the two is my responsibility to close, I guess, through a lot of work and learning how to renew my mind with truths. And sometimes we don't get our needs met as kids. If we needed a lot more comfort or pause or more stimulation from a moment than what we got, if there was, in your daughter's case, 3 really important people taken abruptly from her life, that might not be, if you guys would have known at that moment that would be such a traumatic moment for her, you might have responded differently, right? You could have enveloped her with more, care and teaching and whatever you could do at the moment for her for the few months after that, right? But a lot of times with our kids, we don't see how that wound is manifested until later. And so there's no going back, but you can help her know, hey, this happened. We're not sure what you learned from this moment, right? Like it might be, it's hard to know, and you don't want to guess too much, but you want to be able to offer some suggestions to try to normalize so that she can grasp onto like, hey, that is something that I kind of think, right? Like she might think it's unsafe to grow up because these, my siblings were growing up and then they got taken away from me. It's not always going to make sense from an adult perspective. And so I just always need to act, or when I'm scared or when I'm bored, I need to act really young. And to help her see where that came from is like a first step, and then kind of going from there.
So we, as her parents, then need to figure out the antecedent to her behavior. We have to do a little bit of discovery there, is what I think I'm hearing.
Yeah. Like what is her emotional state when just prior to you seeing the behavior, right? And so what triggers that shift, but then also what is she trying to get? What need is she trying to get from acting in a different way?
Man, that's a lot of work, but
yeah,
I know it's worth it. And for any parent out there that's dealing with that, whether your kid is 7 or 17, because I know that can happen as well. I think this is really good advice on figuring out where that trauma point, that trigger point may have happened for your kid. And something that I've learned recently is that trauma doesn't have to be something that we deem as traumatic. It could be something really small that just kind of twists the way we see the world, even ever so slightly. And so sometimes we may as parents, or we may as siblings or adults miss that moment for people and then almost diminish it whenever we find out what it is, but it's still just as true to them,
right?
Or true-ish to them.
True-ish
to them as can be. So you mentioned something about self-identification. And I think that right now we are in a really strange climate, a really strange environment here. Not even just in the US, but a lot of parts in the world. It's almost this rise of self-identification. We see it with the LGBTQ plus movement. We see it with kids just almost like searching for that importance, or that they're drawn to themselves. We see that even with adults, where it talks about me time and self-care and all these things. So why are people drawn to this thing? Because in my opinion, and I'll give you my opinion before you give us an answer, but I almost feel like it's an empty endeavor, because the more we focus on ourselves, the less we're able to see what's actually around us, the less we can have gratitude, the less we can almost help people. Why do you think people are so drawn to this? Why is it that we are now living in a culture where your surface identity seems to carry way more value than the content of your character?
People are self-focused. People are self-centered. And I have a hard time getting this concept through to some, but it's just so clear to me, I can't back down from it, that even people who see themselves as, I don't do anything for myself, I'm always trying to please other people, go without in order to provide for others, even that, if they are willing to really let some light be shed on their heart's true motivations, it's because that happens to be what brings them pleasure, right? They feel safe and happy when people around them are happy. And so even those people that we might on the outside see as selfless are truly quite selfish and focusing on seeking their own pleasure. It's just defined more nicely for them. It looks better on the outside than someone who's just, stealing whatever they want because they want it. That looks bad on the outside, but it's not too different from, between those two people. So because we're self-centered and interested mostly in, pleasing ourselves according to what we think will bring us good experiences, we see the world through that lens. So, and you can see that in societies, like whatever this one society has decided is good, we want everybody else to see it that way too, right? I mean, you can go way back to see that in how different groups of people interact or take over or try to persuade. So because we see ourselves as knowing what is good and what is true, and we really deceive ourselves in letting us think that our view is accurate. It doesn't have to match what we see on the outside, right? And so there maybe used to be more of a conformity of, hey, this is what our group, our society, our community thinks is good and true, and so this is what I also think is good and true. But now we're seeing that it is more individual based, right? And as I think, because people, especially maybe the younger generation, doesn't have as much interactive involvement with like community of different generations, people working together, doing tasks together, relying on each other, focused on, maybe their town or their church or their community. This younger generation isn't getting that sense of, this is what our community believes. And so it's more of a, what do I believe? And let me kind of reach out and ask, hey, I feel this way. And so what does that mean about me? And they're asking these random strangers on the internet to give them guidance on who they are. And so if you're a youth that feels a little confused about who you are, and you ask some stranger, or maybe it's an influencer that isn't strange to you, but they certainly don't know you, and you ask for guidance, they're gonna tell you whatever they want to tell you, like their own unknown motivations for speaking untruth into you. So we're seeing a rise of people just feeling one way, reaching out to strangers for guidance, and then latching onto that, even though it goes against what maybe their family has taught them or their community has taught them. But because there's not that level of interaction, working with the family on things, working in the community on things, this youth can just really go astray and just keep running down this path of whatever I feel is reality. And it's sad to see.
I agree with that. I remember growing up as a kid, you would be out in the community with your friends, but every neighbor knew your parents. Yeah. Every neighbor knew you.
And so they might say like, "Oh, that's not how a cuffie acts."
Exactly.
Like, your mom's not going to like when I tell her you're doing that. And then there's this process you go through of like, "Oh, yeah, I'm a cuffie. Mm-hmm. I need to do this. This is what we do. And I don't want my mom to know I'm doing that," right? And so current day stuff will say, well, that's because you're not free to be your real self, and you feel oppressed and have to act like this family name that's on you, and that you need to just push through that, and it doesn't matter who your family is. It doesn't matter what your mom's taught you. You just need to go be your real self, right? And that wouldn't fly before.
No, not at all.
And where does that end? I mean, what we know, even the people that teach this, that you can be whatever you want to be, however you feel and identify on the inside as who you really are, instead of trying to match that with reality of the physical world. Even those people will agree that feelings change over time. And what a 10-year-old thinks is very different than what a 20-year-old thinks. And
absolutely,
how do you reconcile encouraging someone to go with what their feelings are, and instead of helping them bridge that gap between where they're feeling and what reality is? Like, just help them bridge that gap, right?
Yeah. And I think you said it best earlier when you talked about how a lot of people try to take teenagers and almost cement them into this lifelong thing. And that's almost the same thing that's happening with this self-identification is they're taking these 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and they're basically saying who you are today is who you're going to be 50 years from now. And I'm not who I was 5 years ago.
Right. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh my gosh. Thank goodness. Yeah. My wife would be very upset if I was the same person that I was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think it's so dangerous, and just the rise of, you see young adults and teenagers. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to blame phones, but they're on their phones. Mm-hmm. And I've seen groups of them that are friends moving about together, and not a single one is talking to each other. Every single one is on their individual device. They don't know how to interact with people. They don't know how to, they don't have a self-respect. They don't have respect for older people, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is where a society can renew itself, is when the older generation can implant really good morals and ideals into the younger generation. And that's where it goes on, because if everyone is held hostage to what their parents are saying, what's going to happen when you have kids? Are your kids held hostage too? Mm-hmm. You're going to want them to represent your family name. You're going to want them to represent that. And I think it's just a purposeful dismantling of the family unit and how families are designed. Families are designed to take care of each other and to take care of the community. So where do we go from here then with this next generation? You and I are both in an influential position in both of our roles. So where do we go from here? Where does the listener go from here? How do we turn back the clock or whatever to help these young people really understand the importance of being defined by more than just your surface ID, but being defined by the community and how God defines you and how and what you're called to be?
Yeah, realizing that growing up is challenging, right? There's a lot of stuff to figure out. There's a lot of stuff to learn. And for this generation that's growing up now to now have this added component of a huge question to consider. Like, did God put me in the wrong body? That's a big question. And that's a question that did not distract us when we were growing up. We didn't have that question asked of us and thrown out there. So helping the youth not get distracted by that question, right? Because it's simply a distraction. God did not put you in the wrong body. You might have a difficult time feeling comfortable and safe in your body. And let's look at why that is, because there's reasons why that is. For some people, it could be they experienced some kind of trauma related to their body or related to how they saw other people's bodies being used, or even maybe a power difference in their home between a man and a woman. Whatever the scenario, right? We can help that youth see how and why they're believing they would rather be different than who God made them to be. But then also help them look past that, right? Like part of why so many youth are trying now to be a different gender, to act a different gender, or believe that they're in the wrong body physically, is because they've been taught that if they make this change, it would solve a lot of their problems. And so they're taught to idolize this concept that, and time will pass and time will tell. We're seeing some of this already, but that people learn the hard way. If you were to transition, say, to a different, especially physically, if you were to transition, it turns out you're still you. Mm-hmm. And there's nowhere you can go to get away from you. And that's not a bad thing. It just takes wanting to accept the love that God has for you, and to know and accept that he doesn't make mistakes. And we as a society, because we think that whatever we think and feel is accurate, and we judge things as if we're God, that there are some mistakes, right? If we start down the road of believing that, especially as Christians, if we start down the road believing that God messed up, where does that end, right? And some Christians are already over this slippery slope and think that, and have lost the concept of the sanctity of life, where we judge with pregnancies if it's a pregnancy that I'm wanting, or I feel safe having, or is at an okay time, or with an okay person, then there's value to this life. But otherwise, there's not. And I can do whatever I want with this life. And that's not much different of a concept than, hey, I don't feel comfortable in my own body, and I think that God made a mistake, and I think I'm really a boy. Because we're standing in the seat of judgment at that point. Like, we're saying that it doesn't matter what reality is. We're going with what we think and feel about it, instead of realizing that our thoughts and feelings are deceived. Like, we don't see clearly. And we know that as adults. We know that because, like we said before, we don't think the way we did when we were children. We think differently now, and that's going to continue. So right now, today, I mean, there's some things I can speak with like a surety that there are some basic principles and concepts that are true and real, but that's not because they come from my head, right? They come from more of God's word and what people that are wiser and have walked through figuring out what is truth, that's where these ideas come from, right? So I can hold on to these principles and concepts and know that the way I think and feel is going to continue to change as I age and have different experiences, but there are some principles and foundational concepts that just are what they are.
You're right. And I do agree with you there. It's almost no, let's call it what it is. It's a perversion of how God designed things. And we know that Satan can't create anything new, right? So what he has to do is take whatever God deemed for good and make it perverted for his own way. So we see, like you said, the sanctity of life. I am wholeheartedly against the idea of abortion because I believe that every life needs to have an opportunity, every single life. Does that mean that bad things don't happen? No, that doesn't mean that. My wife and I had 4 miscarriages. I understand the pain of what it means to lose your kid. But I believe that God designed life to help bring forth more life. So if we are taking it upon ourselves to say, like you said, we are in the judgment seats. We know more than God. We who are beings that live at max 120 years at this point, we know so much more than God because of how we think it and how we believe it. That's a complete distortion.
Right.
And
Right.
you know, and that's the same thing. Like, it's just, I just feel like every single thing that God has put here for our good is being attacked.
Yeah.
And as believers, we have,
Including God.
yeah,
right?
including God.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually listening to this Glenn Beck podcast, and he was interviewing a Pastor Jonathan. I don't remember his last name, but he was talking about the 3 spirits of this world that always pervert cultures, and you know, they're biblical. So Baal, Ishtar, and Moloch, and how Baal's role is to strip God out of society. And Pastor Jonathan talked about how we saw that in, I believe it was the 50s, when they took prayer and Bible out of schools, and then Ishtar's role is to bring sexual perversion in and all these other things. So we saw that with the sexual revolution of the 60s, where, you know,
And even beyond,
Even
way
beyond,
far
yeah.
back. Yeah.
yeah. So it's
Yeah.
almost cyclical. And then Moloch is child sacrifice. Like, he attacks children. So what do we
Here
have?
we are.
Roe v. Wade coming in the 70s. And then, of course, we see what the ramifications are of those. I talk about all the time how the African American community was like 73% father and
Yeah.
mother together. And then, you know, and then we get this public assistance or public
Right.
welfare thing that happens. And now it's like 21% of African American households have both a mother and a father in it. And we see the degradation of society. We see what's happening in Chicago. We see what's happening in Atlanta and Baltimore, where I grew up, where you have these kids that are growing up without fathers. You have these kids growing up without, you know, both parents in the household, and they don't have a hope for the future. And that's twisted and perverse. So I can see it, and I'm glad you're bringing that up, because we do see that. We see the attacks on the family. We see the attacks on what God says, because God says that we are loved. God says that we are his children. God says
Right.
that we are perfect beings.
Which brings us back to your original question that, the more you dive into his word and realize the difference between who he actually is versus the twist that the world has, I guess, I don't know, propagandized God. But then also, what is it that God actually says? And reading it in his word makes us see just how vulnerable we are to the deceptions. Like, when I'm aware that my thought is, oh, I'm not good enough, and I know what God says about he will provide, and he's sufficient, and his word is sufficient, and I'm here to serve him and his purposes, then I have that choice of, am I going to, kind of ruminate and nurture those thoughts and feelings that I have apart from God, or am I going to believe what God says and obey what he says, even if it's a little different than how I'm feeling, right? And for people that don't know his word, what are they using to pull the filters off of their eyes, or the scales off of their eyes? And they don't have that truth to even know, okay, because it's a different experience if you you're having a down day and you're really in touch with these lies that you're believing about yourself, and yet you know them to be lies.
Correct.
You just have a hard time convincing yourself of the truth. That's a different experience than not knowing those are lies, right? And this idea of relativism, where there's no absolute truth, everybody just gets to believe whatever they want, and somehow that
Insanity.
that is a thing, is a big part of what, like, we're all indoctrinated with that thought, even if with that way of thinking, even if we don't realize it completely, because that's kind of the struggle of, if I believe this, it must be true, right? Even though I know God's word says this is true, I'm believing this and it's true. Instead of, if we weren't indoctrinated with relativism, we would surrender our deceptions much more easily, because we would know that this absolute truth is absolute.
Absolutely. And I think that's why in God's word, he says to test the word.
Yeah.
You know, God doesn't want us to just blindly follow him. He wants us to prove him at his word, right?
If he wanted us to blindly follow him, he wouldn't have given us free will. We wouldn't have gotten ourselves into this mess to begin with.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm encouraged then that we always have that source to come back to. And I'm encouraged by the notion that there does seem to be a groundswell of people that are trying to get back to the root and the heart of what God designed.
Yeah, that is very encouraging.
Even younger people, right? Mm-hmm. You see
they're hungry. Like they I think that you can only eat junk food for so long before you're like, yeah, give me that plate of vegetables.
Exactly.
I need it.
Exactly.
I want something real and healthy.
Yeah. Because you said it best. Even if you change who you are on the outside, you can't run away from you. I think that's a great line.
And I think righteously angry, but let God convict me if that's not quite it, at people's lies when they're speaking to the youth and convincing them differently. Because you can't get to the third decade or the fourth decade in your life and not realize that whatever it is you sought after so hardcore isn't empty when you get there, right? So we call it the elusive horizon of happiness. We think, as long as I, get a good date to the prom, then I'll be happy. Or as long as I get a good grade on that test, then I'll be happy. As long as I get into a good school, then I'll be happy. A good job, marriage, whatever. Cut and paste any social marker of success. And when we're honest with ourselves, we realize, well, those things were nice and, they were enjoyable, but there was not a then we're happy ever after. There's always something else to chase after, right? And someone, I don't even know to give them credit, sorry, but had pointed out that, they were trying so hard to get into either Yale or Harvard. And they had said no to so many things in high school just to stay focused on this goal. And they got to where they were and they were so happy for a little while, but they looked around and saw everybody walking by was just as miserable or happy or distracted as they were in high school. It's not that you get to this goal and you then are, forever. And so it stands to reason that if you're unhappy about something and you then make a physical change, whether permanent or temporary, that too is not going to bring anything other than momentary happiness, which might really just be distraction. And so I don't understand why adults would be telling kids anything different. Like we want kids to benefit from our knowledge and whether we've learned it the easy way or the hard way, it's natural. It's good to want to pass that on. And so I wonder, for the adults who are passing on something more damaging, where does that come from? Right?
Probably selfishness.
Yeah.
Like you said before.
And how deceived they must be, though, to think this way themselves and then to be so sure that they're going to pass that on and it doesn't match reality.
It may go back to the whole idea of misery loving company, right? Like I think of somebody that may be teaching kids the wrong thing. They are so miserable in their life, and this is my assumption. They're probably so miserable in their life that they want more people to be miserable as well. Just like when we're in a good place, the thing you want to do is share the good news, right? So I think we do both of those things. When we're in a bad place, we want other people to be in that bad place as well. And when we're in a good place, we want that as well. But then God's right there where he's like, this is where you need to be at all times. And if we can get more people to understand that realignment, I think...
That's the humbling part, though, right? What it takes, though, to even be willing to yield to the Lord is a humility. That we do have a lifespan here of 120 max, and most of us 80.
Yeah.
Right? It's really mind-blowing to think that of all the generations that have come before us, that somehow our 80 years of being here is so right, or is so
important.
Important that we wouldn't defer to the God of the universe who is without beginning and without end. Like, how do you not?
I think you nailed it right there. Absolutely. How do you not?
Yeah.
You're right to think of all the people that have come before us that are trying their hardest to impart that wisdom. But so many of us choose the echo chambers. We choose the people that don't have our best interests at heart, because the message comes across a little softer. It tastes a little sweeter. The initial burst of it energizes you versus convicts you. We tend to run to those things versus saying, let me see which one is right. Let me take the time and invest the energy in figuring out the right thing versus everything else. And
and I've just recently, I grew up Christian, right? And grew up going to church, and I genuinely had a relationship with the Lord, an active prayer life, and I can see his hand in my life even as a young child. But what's new in my life now is a real desire to know his word. And I wish that I had yielded to this earlier, right? But I, being somebody who sought a lot of education, it was a hard thing for me to want to know the word more than I wanted to know the world's knowledge. And I used to really believe that education, secular education, was the key to everything. Like, it was the key to, making sure your parents' ceiling is your own floor for launching and doing more, right? And I just really saw it differently. And now I've been learning how to read the Bible from a different angle of it really is so applicable to everything. There aren't new emotions under the sun. There aren't new relationship struggles. None of this is new. And God really has given us everything we need to be able to know what is his way. What did he design us for? Why are we here? How are we to relate to people? What are we to expect from others and from this world? And what are we to expect even from ourselves? And just all those big questions are completely answered. And yet, because of my pride, which I see now, I really didn't ever want that to be the answer. I didn't go to a place where I would get A's and get accolades for studying the Bible beyond like maybe Sunday school, a little bit here and there. But now, more than anything, I want to know what God says about this world. And so it's an awkward position to be in because of the schooling that I had chosen, all the money and the time and the effort put into learning. maybe not the best, but pretty much the best of what the world has to say about how people function and how relationships work and what's needed and how to have positive well-being and everything. Like, some of what the world teaches is consistent with what the Bible teaches, right? There are some things that the world has discovered as true that it is true simply because it's already true. They have different words for it, right? Like more psych jargon, but if it's true, it's true. But they don't have the transformative power to offer that God's word does. And so I've sought a lot of what the world has to say, and the parts that are the real meaty parts are the ones that, turns out, God already said that stuff a long time ago, and I could have been reading the Bible for free.
That's
right?
true. So how do you combat that then in your practice? Because obviously the practice that you're in isn't Christian based.
Oh, it is.
Oh, it is?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought it wasn't. Okay.
Yeah. So I used to work at an only secular practice. And at that point, I was still very much believing this other lie that I had been indoctrinated into, which is an expansion of the distorted separation of church and state, that I could somehow be a Christian, and yet that wouldn't infiltrate my interactions as a therapist, that I could keep that separate. And I thought that was true, that I could still offer really good, helpful process assistance, right? And that good would come from it. And at some point along the way there, I started realizing that I was practicing with two hands behind my back, and it just didn't jive anymore. Once I was convicted of that, the hypocrisy that I was experiencing hurt, like it had an impact. And so God works in bizarre ways, but I ended up then working at a Christian psychological practice, and where we can openly use faith and God's word to help create change. And that definitely is better. It's still, because of my training being secular, I'm at this weird spot where I know that God has more to offer through his word than any secular psych concept or even practice. And I'm getting more able to offer more of that, but I'm not, it's a little muddy right now. Yeah. And as a psychologist also, it's not my role, and it's even against my ethics, the ethical code that I comply with as a psychologist, to push anything on anyone, right? And so that's where things get muddy right now, is because God chooses different times to draw people to himself, right? And so, and we're all at a different point in the process of becoming Christ-like, and part of that means we're at a different point in the process of knowing just how deceived we've been and still are. And so there are a lot of Christians who come to see me who haven't yet fallen in love with God's word and don't want that to be the answer either.
Okay.
And so that gets messy.
That can't be easy.
It's becoming more difficult.
Oh. Just for full disclosure, so I recently went through with you a class to learn how to be better at counseling people biblically and learning some of those techniques. And something that really surprised me while you were teaching this class was how much reflection, and I'm not going to say self-reflection because then we're going back to the mistake there, but how much reflection is necessary to become better at counseling people. And the reflection that I'm referring to is more reflecting on what God says and how we're supposed to then emulate that in our own lives. And I'm reminded of the passage in, I believe it was Mark, where Jesus was saying, how can you look at a speck in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own eye?
Right.
And I felt like that was something that really stood out to me during those sessions we were having when we were talking about the lies of our heart and anger and all these things where we look at it naturally like, oh, I'm allowed to be this, or it's fine, but other people can't. And it was just really cool to see that to step into the world that you're in, you have to do a lot of reflecting on God almost constantly. So the fact that you are in love with his word right now, I know it may not seem like you're getting it, but I can tell you that knowing you personally, you are so far ahead than what you think. I just want to encourage you there because I see it. I get to see it almost every day. And you know, it's just a beautiful thing to see somebody that is purposefully working on their own life, but not through a selfish sort of take on it, but more of I want to be more like Christ.
Yeah.
I want to represent God. And the things that I'm seeking, the prayers that I'm asking for, the way that I interact with people is the way that you're doing that is slowly morphing over time. And I got to say, it's really cool to see. So I know it may seem hard, but you are on the right track. And I just want to encourage everyone out there too, you know, examine your heart, examine the things that you are telling yourself, examine those things and cross-reference them to what God says about you and use that as the mantle that you're putting on your head.
Yeah.
Use that as the armor that you're wearing. Use that as the thing that you are, as your calling card, right? Because there's something different and unique about an encounter with Jesus and a relationship with God. And you're right. The more you read his word, the more you can see how everything in this life has been answered in those 66 books. Every single issue, problem, anxiety, whatever, everything has been answered. We just have to be willing to look into it, examine it, and test it because God's calling us to test those things. And I'm just amazed to see your growth over the past few years. Seriously.
So when we start with the idea that God's design is good, very good, and then we mess that up, and if that's our starting point, then it makes so much sense to study his word and what he tells us instead of to put too much value into our own thoughts or feelings that have gotten messed up. I mean, we're just deceived. Our hearts are deceived even. And so if you have that starting point, and then the more you dive into his word and the more you experience that it's with this loving conviction, he just like turns the light on a little bit at a time and lets you see things more clearly, then he designs us to respond well to that. Like, I mean, we can stay in our rebellion and think that God doesn't know what he's talking about. We have that option, but it's stupid. And it is a transformation when you know him to be a loving, truly loving and good father who is holy and just and righteous. He's not some soft, squishy waiter that just brings me whatever I want whenever I want it.
Thank God he doesn't do that.
Yeah. That he, in his perfection, shows me more and more of what's between us, right? Like what's in the way between me being who he fully designed me to be, which is someone in complete fellowship with him, taking directives from him, and being about his business, right? Instead of my life, this is about whatever I want it to be, and it's all about me, and I just want to make me happy, and I can be whatever I want to be, and I.
That is a perfect full circle right there. Bringing it back to the original idea there is that we cannot exemplify or be everything that we have been called to be if the missing component in our life is God.
Yeah, specifically Christ bridging us back to God, right?
Correct.
And then allowing for the Holy Spirit to indwell in us as our guide, right? As our counselor. So when the Holy Spirit is our counselor and we learn to listen to him more loudly than ourselves by developing a practice of following and obeying and studying and obeying even when it doesn't make sense, because we've already accepted the idea that God's way is the absolute truth and right way, and that our way is deceived. So if God's way doesn't make sense to us, that's okay. We can still obey because we know we're in a place of deception. We're just not seeing clearly. And so it would make sense that something that is good and true might not make sense to us in that moment, but it will, or it doesn't have to. We know him to be just the reason and the purpose for everything. Like otherwise we just, we live life avoiding getting wrinkly, avoiding getting aches and pains, and then we eventually do anyway. And then what? We lay on our deathbed realizing we sought after all the wrong things and our time is over, and what a waste.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up, is that understanding. So the 3 words that I have in this podcast are life, leadership, and hope. And the only hope that I know of that can be found is in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
That's the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Not wasting our lives chasing after the empty things or that infinite horizon, as you called it.
Elusive horizon.
Elusive horizon.
Yeah, that you never quite get to.
That's right. But we do have a Savior, and we have a loving God who is standing right in front of us, and he's calling us, and he's designed you for a purpose. And if you would just walk in obedience, things won't be easier, but your life will mean so much more than anything else. Because the truth is, you are. Like, when you get older, it sucks. It sucks. Responsibility sucks. Aging sucks. My knees hurt every time I wake up in the morning. My back hurts in the evening. It sucks. And growing old is not for the weak. But imagine what your life can be and how it can look if Jesus is at the center.
And I think even that is a blessing, because the Lord, for those of us who get to age to really old, we won't be able to deny as easily to ourselves that we're as capable as we think we are, right? Like we get to experience, despite our best efforts, becoming more frail, more weak, more dependent on others. And I see that as a blessing because we're a little less deceived then, right? Where people in their prime
that's good.
really think they can still hold on to their pride because they're still maybe able to do a little more, right? And so when people complain about aging, like I get the physical aspect isn't pleasant, but the long-term aspect of seeing a little more clearly, like who we really are, like how little we really are, how limited we really are, that's a blessing that can like kind of, I don't know, unveil some of the truth to people who otherwise would still not understand their place in the world in relation to our Heavenly Father.
That's a good perspective. I'm glad you said that. I love that perspective about how it does reveal God a little bit more to us.
Yeah.
And that's something to look forward to then.
Yeah.
That makes...
And even to see as a loving God, like that's part of his provision, right? Like not only did we get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, thankfully, so that we couldn't eat from the tree of life any longer. And so that our physical life here really is temporary and we're not stuck like this forever. But even within that death process, the Lord has worked a plan into helping us see more clearly, even those of us that are more stubborn or resistant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even that, like even in something that the world sees as bad, like physically growing older and getting more wrinkles and gray and sags and all that, the world sees that as bad and as something to avoid. And God has provided so much richness in that process.
Yeah, I think Solomon talks about that when he talks about wisdom, like seeking it out. And wisdom comes through experience and it comes through obedience.
Yeah.
We're literally replacing the pride of life for the jewel of wisdom.
Yeah.
And that's actually a cool take and a cool perspective on that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you said that. That is really awesome. But this conversation has been so enlightening for me. It really has. I think that we covered a lot of really cool things here, but very serious topics that I think people need to hear, and it's going to resonate with people. So
good.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. I know you hate when I call you that because we're friends, but I told you, you're the smartest person that I know, and I think you proved that today. But if you are listening or watching to this, I really do hope that you can see the gaps in your knowledge and that you will turn to Jesus, turn to God, and really seek his knowledge and his wisdom. Whether you're dealing with family issues, whether you're dealing with work issues, whether you're dealing with a sense of hopelessness, God is the answer for you. And it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how wise you think you are in your own strength. There is a God of the universe who designed things specifically for us. And you just have to walk in it through obedience. This was episode 11 of the Uncuffed podcast, and I will see you next time.